Okay, hi guys. So I want to give you a bit of guidance for your applied physiology assessment. Okay, so this is lifted straight from your handbook, so you have access to this. All right, but effectively, what you guys are required to do is produce a full lab report. All right, on one of the practical sessions that we've done. All right, so we've done 3 in total. I'll recap them in a minute. All right. But effectively, within that lab report, you need to demonstrate the understanding of sort of underlying principles that we've covered. All right, for each of the topics. So if it was, for example, flexibility, then obviously the underlying principles of flexibility. You need to consider the key methods used. All right, and then more importantly, which is probably the purpose of a lab report, is to interpret the data that's been collected. Okay, using relevant statistical tests. All right. Within your report, obviously, you need to sort of draw conclusions to your findings by disproving or proving your hypotheses, which obviously you should state in there, and that should be supported or not with relevant academic literature. All right. You are also encouraged to include figures. Okay, that's really important to represent the data, but obviously ensuring that they're correctly formatted, and it should be presented as a scientific piece. Okay, so appropriate formatting should be adhered to throughout. All right, and your submission, as always, for year 2 should not exceed 2,000 words, 10% either way. Okay, so 1,800 to 2,200. Okay, so just sort of bear that in mind. Okay, so in terms of the practicals that we have done, then. Okay, so we've looked at altitude, we've looked at flexibility with gonometry, and then we've looked at peak power. So perhaps some of the questions that you might choose, all right, you can sort of paraphrase these if you want. It's entirely up to you. But in terms of naming your report, all right, does an increase in altitude affect grip strength and reaction time? That's obviously what we looked at. Does a prescribed warm-up affect the range of motion during hip flexion and hip extension? Again, that's what we looked at with the gonometry in the gym. And then does a correlation exist between thigh circumference and peak power? Okay, so you can choose to sort of paraphrase these if you want. That's entirely up to you. And then I've also got the exemplar, which I will show you now. Hopefully that will load. Hey, Charlie's popped up. Here he is, look. Be embarrassed. Right, so hopefully this will work. He says. Here we go. Taking his time. Right, here we go. So this is the example. This is on Blackboard for you, excuse me, as well, to give you some sort of idea. Okay, so this exemplar last year, I think, was awarded 73%. Okay, so give you an idea of quite a really good piece of work for year 2. So just to give you some sort of idea what it needs to look like. Obviously I showed you this before, but I'll sort of talk through it. So in terms of what it looks like, obviously a nice title page. So that was the question that was sort of posed to guide the investigation. Obviously you'll set this up, what your researcher is, who your lab partners were, the instructor, which would have been me, when the date of the test was, and then the submission of the report. A nice contents page, okay, kind of sets the scene. All right, appropriately formatted as well, so no sort of indentations. These come under methodology, and that will become sort of consistent when you do your dissertation as well. So participants, apparatus, okay. And again, notice how it's just all correctly formatted. It makes the reader, i.e. me, want to read it. Page numbers as well, that's important. Okay, so in terms of your introduction then, so introduction, this is a bit of an opportunity for you to include some academic literature around the specific topic. So obviously this lab report was based on flexibility, so there's a little bit in there around flexibility, what the primary purpose is. All right, so introducing the investigation, and then obviously a little bit of background around flexibility in particular. Okay, so lots of different sources in there in a short space of time. Okay, in terms of how much is written, I think he summarized that quite well. So bear that sort of in mind. Based on that sort of literature then, okay, you've got your hypotheses, So you have your hypothesis, what you expect to happen. Okay, so that would be your H1. Okay, and then your H0, which is your null hypothesis, is effectively the opposite. Okay, so in this case, the hypothesis was the range of motion of the hip, flexion and extension, will increase. That's what you expect to happen. And then your null hypothesis is that there will be no change. Okay, and again, reference to the p-value there. Your methodology obviously talks about the participants. Remember, no names mentioned. Okay, what participants, what age, sort of what gender they were, what is the standard deviation of age. Okay, everyone completed a par Q. You all did. Okay, so acknowledge that. Within that, then, okay, once you've introduced, the client talks there about anonymity. Okay, so talk about subjects A to F as opposed to subject names. Okay, to protect identity. That's really important. Then the apparatus. So this is where you need to know what the exact apparatus were. Okay, which names or the actual brand of equipment. Okay, so you need to make sure you're detailed on that. Your design and procedure. So this is where your data collection procedure was actually administered. So that needs to be typed up in detail. Okay, so how was data actually collected? Okay, what was the whole procedure from, in this case, the warm-up, from starting pre-warm-up, what was taken, how was it taken? You can reference to the slides. You can look at the slides on that, particularly if it's around gonometry. Tells you where the placement of the gonometer should go. So again, keep that in mind. But this needs to be as detailed as what was the actual procedure that was followed to collect the data, right from the start to when the last piece of data was collected. Okay. So just bear that in mind. Again, this is on there for you. All right. So you can access this example on Blackboard, and I'll show you where that is in a little bit. Okay. But again, if you're doing gonometry, the placement of the gonometer is on the PowerPoints, as is with altitude. You need to be aware of what we did with that. Okay, how long we exercised for, what altitude did we go to. All right, so you should have written all that down during our practicals. And with the peak power, what I've done, there is a Wingate presentation on there. Obviously, you didn't do the full Wingate. We just did a 10-second data collection, all right, after a certain amount of time warm up. Okay, and you need to remember what sort of resistance you put on there as well, in terms of your peak power. All right, and then how long you cooled down for. Okay, what was the equipment used, which obviously would go up by the apparatus. All right, so you need to know that it was a Monarch bike. Okay, so again, all this is the sort of things that you should have written down as we were collecting it. So if you sat there aimlessly, then okay, you're going to struggle. You need to ask some questions. So with the results and discussion, then, all right, this is where we present. Okay, what was recorded. So based on the data that we collected, all right, what did we see? All right, and that is perhaps quite prescriptive. So what is the data telling us that we're seeing? Okay, and then more importantly, this is where your statistical tests come into it. Okay, so this here was sort of the results of what was actually happening. And again, notice how the table is formatted. Okay, oh, my phone's going off. So notice how the table is sort of formatted. Again, it must be appropriate to scientific pieces. All right, in terms of the way it's labeled for one, and also presented. All right, so sort of bear that in mind. Interestingly, inclusion of sport, so we can get some sort of comparison across. And again, remember the important thing, sort of mean, standard deviation, all right, and what that obviously, and what that means. So we just present the data for what it is. Okay. Obviously, the inclusion of graphs is encouraged. So obviously, what you can see here, pre and post. Is that necessarily the best graph to illustrate this with? Possibly not. All right, so consider what sort of graph you're using. Okay, in terms of to show is there an increase pre and post, all right, and how that looks. You can have a little play around and obviously choose the most appropriate. And then in terms of obviously how that's labeled, that will come down as a figure, so it needs to be labeled appropriately as well. Okay, within there, you obviously need your statistical test as well to show your significance. All right, which is your p-value. So this individual chose to do an ANOVA. In this test, you could also do a paired two-tail t-test, and I've put a video up of how to perhaps do them on Blackboard. But you guys should know how to run an ANOVA, okay, because you did it for your research methods with Max, okay. So there should be some crossover. You should be able to generate the p-value, and then it being greater or lower than 0.05. All right, and then you should be able to know what that means, okay, and then interpret that appropriately. All right, in terms of your discussion, you could perhaps include, reference back to some of the literature, okay. Is there things that talk about, is there academic articles, that talk about how warm-up impacts flexibility, which you can include, which might help, illustrate why you found what you found. And interestingly, with some of the data you've collected, do certain sports lend themselves to, in this case, being more flexible? So would we expect someone with a trampolining background to perhaps be more flexible than perhaps a rugby union player? And again, can you include literature perhaps to support that? All right, which might relate to the demands of the sport. Okay, so I would expect some reference to literature, particularly in our discussion, and then obviously you finish that with your conclusion. Then what was sort of your main findings, perhaps any acknowledgements of any anomalies, and then also perhaps where future studies could look. All right, and obviously to finish off, reference list. All right, quite considerable amount of references in there, and then obviously he's got an appendices in there. You could put raw data in your appendices if you want, but I think this has been presented quite nicely within text as well. All right, so just consider how you present your lab report, because that's really important to make it look like a scientific piece. Okay, so in terms of your let's go on to Blackboard for you. So in terms of Blackboard, where this sits, okay, so obviously you've got FDSC, okay, that's a picture of Max there, course resources, and then course content. So obviously, as always, where all your resources are, if you go down to applied physiology, all right, what you will note is you've got your example there, okay, so I put that in there for you, which allows you to access the document that I just had open. If you go to lectures, all right, obviously you've got your data, so your altitude data is there, your gonometry data is there, okay, and then you've also got your muscle girth and peak power data there as well, okay. And again, I've put in, so with peak power, you're going to need a correlation, because that's what you're testing. Is there a relationship between muscle girth and peak power? Okay, so that statistical test is a little bit different, and I put a how-to video up on there. And then, like I said, for gonometry and altitude, you could use a paired t-test, all right, and there's a Alex Leach there, what a guy. All right, and there's a video of how to do that. Or you said you could do the ANOVA if you wanted to get your p-value. So everything you need, all right, is up. What I would say is you should have written down some of the, particularly the procedures that we use to collect it. So whichever one you choose, you need to know exactly how you carried that out, okay? Because that is what goes into your methodology part, particularly with the procedure and design, okay? So what I would say is, talk amongst yourselves, ask questions of each other. Some of you took some pictures, all right, so sort of bear that in mind as well. If you guys got any questions for me, all right, let me know, primarily through Microsoft Teams, okay, but obviously I am available on email as well, okay. So if you guys, if you guys need anything, just give us a shout, all right. Decent. Catch you later.